Yay, and we are live. And we have people with us. Great. Welcome, everyone, to Learn with the League, a program brought to you by the League of Women Voters Torrance area. This is part of our education series. If you would like to be notified of future talks, please like our page, and you will be notified of upcoming Facebook Live events and actual live events here in the South Bay part of Los Angeles, California. My name is Athena Paquette-Cormier, and I will be your host tonight. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Aaron Hamlin, Esquire. He's the founder and executive director of Center for Election Science. And he'll be sharing with us how approval voting works towards a fairer election process and how it differs from other alternative approaches being used. So welcome, Aaron, for taking time this evening. I know it's later where you are.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. So while we're chatting, I'll also be monitoring the chat section. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask Aaron, I'll be watching and I'll try and squeeze it in as we can. So let's get started. So Aaron, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, your educational background, professional background, that kind of thing?
Sure. So I have more of a social science background. I did my undergrad in psychology with a math minor. Following that, I did a graduate program in educational psychology, then another graduate program in public health, and following that, a law degree. So that's a little bit about my personal background and focusing more in the nonprofit sector after I finished with all that school. And so I've started up two nonprofits from scratch so far. And very proud of the Center for Election Science and where we started from and where we are now.
Mm-hmm. So you take always learning to kind of the nth degree. I'm always learning. Yeah. So it sounds like quite the combination with your health and social sciences and law degree. You can do quite a bit with that, I would think. So why did you choose this topic, or what drove you to form this nonprofit?
Yeah, I guess I first got interested in the concept of voting methods. Like many people, I didn't know what a voting method was at one point in time. And it was around a particular election when I was in a student group, and I was noticing, like, it was around the 2008 primaries, and we were talking about who we were going to vote for in the primary. And I noticed that people in the group were voting against candidates who were explicitly for their interests. And that was really surprising to me. And because we were all looking at a particular healthcare reform. And when it got to me, I said, well, I'm going to be voting for people who are for this healthcare reform that we're all pushing. And I was really surprised to see so many other really gifted individuals in our program voting against their interests. And I thought, well, this is really weird. And I was frustrated by it. And so I decided to really learn more about voting methods at that point, because that seemed like the culprit for why people were voting against their interests. And after a number of years looking at this issue, I eventually came across other people who were in the same type of recognized that there was a problem, and they were starting to see solutions out there, and they wanted to have a way to organize that. And so I found another online discussion group among people who were interested in political science and math, and applying those tools within those fields to and better elections. And from that original group, we founded the organization and incorporated it as a nonprofit.
So by voting against their interests, do you mean like that there was an issue that that they would, if they were voting for that issue, that they would vote one way, but they voted for a candidate that wasn't in agreement with that? Is that what you mean by voting against their? Okay. Wow. Yeah. And is it because they didn't know, or they didn't care, or they thought there was no solution? What do you think what made them do that, I guess?
They were convinced that the candidates that supported their views were not viable. And so they wanted to vote for someone else who was viable, but it happened that this viable didn't support their issue. So they were explicitly voting for people who didn't support their cause.
Wow.
Because
So
they
do you
didn't want
think
to throw their vote away.
is that maybe why some people just don't vote at all, because they don't feel the people are for their issue? So they say, oh, I can't relate to that person, or
I think that's a big
that's
part of
one
it.
of them.
Yeah. I mean,
so how long ago was that?
So we incorporated in 2011. We got our nonprofit status in 2012. And since then, for a number of years, it was just a working board type organization, and we're doing a number of small projects. And then eventually I went to an executive director role. And at the end of last year, we were finally able to achieve funding in order to be able to bring on additional staff as well. So, and we brought on additional staff for the first time this year. So we're at a really exciting phase of our journey.
So it's kind of like taking off now, right? You had this organizational set of years, I guess we'd call it.
Yeah, that's right.
Kind of infancy, I guess, because 2011, we're 2008. So 7 years of building up, and now you're, I don't want to say legit, but now you're, growing up, right? That's cool.
We have a reasonable budget that allows us to take on ambitious projects.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, so is this your day job, or do you have another day job and a separate job where you feed your family?
This is all I do.
This is all you do.
I'm obsessed with voting methods and making sure that people have a reasonable tool when they're electing people who represent them.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So can you share with us a little bit? I want to hear about your projects, but first, why don't you kind of share with us what is this method that you're, or if there's more than one, that's fine too, but what is this approval voting? What does that mean exactly?
So I guess it's a little bit of a step back. So when we're talking about voting methods, what we're talking about is the expression that you're putting on the ballot and how that's calculated to produce a result. So normally we don't think about this. We just go to vote and we have our ballot in front of us, and our ballot, when we're electing someone like mayor or governor, some single winner position, that ballot will tell us choose one candidate. And then we know that the one candidate with the most votes is the winner. Now, we don't really think about that, but that's a voting method. And that particular voting method is called plurality voting, sometimes called first past the post. It's a very simple voting method. That's right, first past the post, or plurality
What was the
voting.
first term? I kind of didn't hear it right. What was the first term you said it was called?
Either plurality voting or first past the post.
Crowding voting?
Plurality voting.
Okay, how do you spell that?
Plurity.
Oh, plurality. Okay, I got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
You're in the Midwest, huh? I'm just kidding. You have an accent. Okay, sorry. So yeah, right now we can only choose one out of all those people.
Yeah. And it's really an ineffective way to vote. It's not expressive, and when multiple candidates are running, we choose only one of them. And that means that if there are a set of candidates that are similar, then the vote splits between them. And that's not very helpful if we support an idea that's also supported by a number of candidates, because our vote splits and we get an inaccurate reflection of support. And you also get this issue, which I ran into with friends in graduate school before, when they vote against their interest. And so with plurality voting, if you perceive that the candidate that you like is not viable, and you're feeling like you're going to throw your vote away and not have an effect in the outcome of the election, well, plurality voting puts you in that situation. And so with approval voting, you're not in that situation anymore. You've got options now. So with approval voting, you can choose as many candidates as you want. So you're not limited to just one anymore. You can choose as many as you want. And it's important to note, you're not ranking either. This is even simpler than that. You're selecting as many as you want, and the most votes wins. It's a summative system. You're just adding up the approvals per the candidates, and you can only approve one approval per candidate. So you can't like stack a bunch of votes on a particular candidate.
Okay.
And so being able to choose as many candidates as you want is convenient. It has a whole bunch of other nice properties. So if there are similar candidates running, you can support multiple of them. If you like a candidate, but you don't think that they can win, but you want to have an effect in the outcome, well, you're still covered there too. You can support the candidate that you like, but if you want to have a say in the outcome, you can hedge your bets and put an additional approval on, say, one of the front runners that you perceive as being more valuable. So you have more expression and more options.
Mm. So if I have 3 candidates and 2 are similar, I would put a vote on each of the similar people.
That's right.
Is that right? Or the people that I like, I guess, you know. So so in this scenario, would you withhold your third vote? You would only vote for the ones that you really, really want to see succeed.
That's right. You're voting for all the people you would like to see elected. And one of those people would be elected.
So, because I see in so many, and especially here in California, we see it where there's a third candidate who seems to be running on purpose to siphon off votes from someone else, right?
That's right.
One candidate actually came right out and said it in this last primary. So, explain to us how that would hurt that third candidate. How does that play, I guess?
So normally under a plurality voting election, when you're only allowed to choose one, that becomes a big issue, and it's a nasty tactic. People organizing that tactic, they know that people can only choose one candidate, and so they try to make similar candidates so that the vote divides between those similar candidates. But with approval voting, you can support multiple candidates that are similar. And so say there's this candidate like this, we'll call them a clone candidate of somebody else, just to try to divide the vote. Well, under approval voting, that doesn't matter so much. You can choose both of those candidates or more than 2 candidates if there are more than 2 that are similar that fit within an ideology that you like.
Okay. So if there are 2 that I like that are close, I'm actually giving them more strength against this person that is trying to siphon off votes or trying to make it in the old system. I'm
right.
diminishing that guy's power. Is that kind of what it is? By having more?
So if there were 3 candidates in a race, 2 of them were very similar and you liked both of them, and then another candidate you weren't so big on, and you voted for those 2 similar candidates, then you'd have 1 vote for candidate A that you liked, and then another vote for candidate B that you liked. They would be tied with 0. So that would be the sum of the votes with just your ballot.
So I'm sure in your system, you've done testings of outcomes to see if this really plays out, like in fake situations, like you've modeled it or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, there are a number of different ways to look at evaluating a voting method. So we can try to see, on average, how a voting method performs, different types of ancillary effects that it has within elections. And we also look at functional components, just kind of practical components of a voting method and having it implemented. The research indicates through, and when I say this, I mean through different type of computer modeling as well as surveys that poll people using different voting methods. Approval voting tends to elect a more consensus candidate. So a candidate that has broad appeal among, often the candidate has cross appeal among other candidates, and they appeal to the broadest base of the electorate. Another feature of approval voting is that, so a voting method should not only choose a good winner, somebody that represents the electorate well, but it should also provide a good temperature of the other candidates, even if those other candidates don't win. It's important that their ideas be measured appropriately. So if there's a third-party candidate that has, say, bad ideas, well, approval voting should appropriately and does not give them much support. But with a third-party candidate, maybe they don't have the name recognition or money, but they've got good ideas and they're being seen. Well, people can support that third-party candidate, even if they're not perceived as being likely to win. And so that third-party candidate, even if they don't win, they get a much more accurate reflection of support. And that's important for a voting method to be able to treat those candidates well. So just like a marketplace, we want good ideas to be able to go in and out of the marketplace and have them have the opportunity to either succeed or fail. Right now, under our current system, we don't have that. We have a real barrier to new ideas, and that's not good for our democracy. Approval voting does a good job of being able to address that by giving everybody a fair shake. And it's simple, too, in terms of what the way that temperature is gauged for these sort of party candidates. You're just getting an approval percentage, so results that look just like we see in normal elections.
So this is for single seat candidates, like on the local level, that would be the mayor, the treasurer, well, if they're elected, the city clerk, if they're elected. But it wouldn't be for council, because at least here, our council seats are on rotation and there's more than one available, right? A seat opens up at one time. So would this work with council or no, because you have more than one seat?
So that's actually a pretty tricky question. So with approval voting, typically we look at it as a single winner system. That's really what it's designed for. So like you were describing, treasurer, mayor, that kind of thing. You can use it to elect multi-seat offices in a simplistic way, which classifies it as a block system when it's used this way, so that you support all the candidates that you want, and the winners are, like, say you're electing 2 seats, the 2 with the top votes would win. You can do it that way, although the results tend to be having candidates that are homogenous or look a lot alike. They will be good consensus candidates, but they're not going to have a lot of diversity to them. So within something like, say, a council or a state legislature or some kind of governing body where there are multiple seats that you can elect simultaneously, there are other categories of voting methods called proportional voting methods that can be used. And there actually are indeed proportional versions of approval voting that can elect multi-member seats, such as city councils, and have the outcome be proportional. So there, the ballot itself looks just like any other approval voting ballot, where you select all the candidates that you want. Just the way that the algorithm works, so like how the counting works, it makes it so that who actually gets elected, that those people who are elected look a lot like the people who voted within that particular election.
So Mr. William Baugh, I don't know if you know him, but he's made a lot of comments, and one of them was that if you have similar candidates that you oppose, then you can vote against all of them.
Yeah, so it's
That's kind of a brain twister, so I thought I'd ask.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it in kind of different ways. So say like you're mostly indifferent about many of the candidates, but there are, say there's like 1 or 2 candidates that you really don't like, but you're indifferent among everyone else. You can vote for everybody but those 2 candidates if you really have a grudge against 2 particular candidates or 1 particular candidate. If it's against 1 particular candidate and you vote for everybody but that one, there's a technical term for that called an anti-vote. And it's just like you just really hate that person and you're voting for everybody else but that person.
Yeah, I think some people can relate to that. Okay. Okay, and let's see. So he was saying for multiple seats, many thinkers recommend proportional representation, which is, I guess, what you're saying, right?
That's right. Yes.
Okay. So, so let's hear about the actual system. So, is it a paper ballot? Is it like a lot of counties? Our Los Angeles County is huge, and they're moving more and more their systems into. Well, anyway, they're changing our system a lot. So, so how does your system work? Is it computerized? Is it paper? Is it, you know, is the county clerk still counting the vote? Like, how does that work?
So in terms of the medium for how the voting method is expressed and then tabulated, it can really be on any medium, whether that medium is computer software or physical paper. It works with any of them, and it works really well with physical paper too, when you have a bunch of people who have the arduous task of counting up all these votes. And that's really convenient for that type of system, because approval voting, you're simply just adding things up. For instance, with other voting methods, you have complicated transfers over multiple rounds. With approval voting, you're not having to deal with any of that. You're simply adding things up. And there's another, so one of the nice features about approval voting is that it's so easy. So when you're talking about people whose job it is to run these elections, it makes their lives easier. Just for example, one of the properties that approval voting has that makes those people's lives easier is something called precinct summability. And what precinct summability means is that you can have tabulation in local precincts and then take those totals and then come up with an overall election outcome number, say like for the county or something, when you have a bunch of precincts within the county. Now, it may sound like, well, of course you can do that. Well, not always. Some voting methods require that you take all the ballots and then put them together in a central location before you can count them. But with approval voting, you have to worry about that. You can have counting done at local precincts, take those totals, and then add up the totals. You don't have to worry about having all the ballots together in one central location. So that makes logistically much easier, and it also helps some with ballot security as well. If you're trying to think about like making sure that particular ballots are being watched and not having to worry about transporting ballots and being able to follow their trail.
Right. So what would happen if, I had a question asked earlier to ask you, what if, what about like provisional ballots? Like, you know, is that going to change anything when people get to the polling place? Does this change anything with how they, how it works?
I would expect no. So the only difference between approval voting and say something like what we're currently doing is just that you're allowing people to select all the candidates that they want. The directions are going to be different. Pretty much the rest of the ballot design is going to be the same. You're going to see some bubbles that you're going to check off or fill in next to the candidates. Now you can bubble in that bubble for multiple candidates if you like. And that's really the only difference. Other parts in terms of the mechanics of the election, all those other things, those are all the same.
So Caitlin was just saying that it took a long time for her to get San Francisco results just because of that centralized thing. Like in LA County, it works the same way. All the ballots go down to the county registrar's office, and they're all gathered up. And I've never had to do the counting, obviously, but I imagine a bunch of people in a room counting and double counting and all this kind of stuff. So it can take days to find out, especially in a close race, right? It can take days to find out who actually won. So this would cut down on that.
That's right. Approval voting is a nice system for impatient voters.
And so also the mail-in ballot would be the same. I mean, none of the logistics of how you vote would be changed by this, right? That's what you're saying? That's right.
That's right. Okay, yeah, cool. You don't need special software or anything like that.
Okay, and so is this different from range voting? That's something I heard of recently. So what's range voting?
Range voting, sometimes called score voting, is another type of voting method. So when we think about a voting method, conceptually, the way that I keep it straight is I look at it as like, one, is it electing a single winner or a bunch of people at once? Range voting or score voting elects one person at once. And so the way that it works with the expression is that you're given a scale that you fill in for each candidate. And that scale can range from, say, 0 to 5, where 0 is you don't like that candidate at all, and 5 is, oh, I think that's a great candidate, I really want them to win. And so you would fill in these scores for each individual candidate, and then the candidate with the highest average score or total score among all the ballots would be the candidate that wins. So that's range or score voting.
Well, that sounds complicated.
So range or score voting, so that would require a little bit of a different ballot design. So you've got more bubbles per candidate there, and you'd likely have to do some reprogramming with the software. It wouldn't be complicated, but there would be some adjustments that you would have to do. So in terms of complexity, it would be a little bit more complex than approval voting, but still range voting or score voting, it's still an additive system. So it has a lot of those other nice properties as approval voting. Range voting also is very expressive. I would say pretty much the most expressive of any voting method that I can think of. So it's a highly expressive voting method as well. And the reason we tend to prefer approval voting over range voting is that when we look at the type of performance that they have in terms of getting good people elected with research and through simulations, range voting does tend to perform a little bit better, but approval voting is so simple. The tiny bit of loss and performance that you get with approval voting is by far made up by how simple and easy to implement that it is. And it's way better than better.
Way better than what?
Approval voting is way better than our current voting method, and and the same is true for range or score voting.
So could you share with us some of the projects that you've been working on? You said because you got this funding, you've been able to do a lot more projects, or expand. So could you give us an example or some examples of what the projects are that you're working on?
Sure. So two in particular that we're really excited about. One is being able to move forward on a research project using data that we collected during the 2016 election. And then the other major project is running a ballot initiative alongside a local group, Reform Fargo, in the city of Fargo, so that they're able to be the first city to use approval voting. So I can either talk about the research project or
yeah,
Fargo.
I'd love to. Either one, both. Let's hear both. The Fargo one sounds very exciting to me.
I guess starting with the research project, what we did was we did polling we contracted out polling through an international polling company called GFK, and we took a nationally representative sample of registered voters leading up to the election. And we asked them about their voting preferences under a short list of candidates and a long list of candidates. The short list being Clinton, Trump, Stein, and Johnson, and then the longer list being those four plus additional candidates like McMullen, Castle, Cruz, Sanders, and I think we had an additional person on there as well. And so in addition to having two different types of candidate lists, we also asked them to vote under different types of voting methods with those lists. And so we asked them to vote under plurality voting / first past the post, both of those being two names describing the same thing, approval voting, range voting, which we just described, and instant runoff voting, also known as ranked choice voting.
Okay. And so you have results in your computer, but you're not sharing the results. And what do you want to do with this? What do you want to do with this research?
So right now we're actually finishing up the paper with with the Paris School of Economics. There are a number of really prestigious researchers there that we have a good relationship with, that we've been writing the paper with. And so we're actually in the process of choosing the journal to submit to. And during that process, it can take a bit in order to get things published. Like the lag time is quite long in academia. But in the interim there, once it's clear on where we're publishing it, we'll be able to put up a preview of the paper as well as be able to share the raw data that we used for the study.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that sounds fascinating. Because that, it just does seem like the noise you see are the two main parties, and people never really fully get to vote all the way through, right? And I think that's what some of these third-party candidates are upset about, is their voice is not heard the way the others are, right? So
Totally.
So I mean, that's personally what upsets me a little bit, but so it sounds like those results will at least give evidence that another way should be looked at, right? I mean, I would assume.
Yeah. We had some we took some interesting approaches in order to analyze voting methods in a way that I think is pretty unique compared to the way that it's been addressed previously in literature. So, for instance, we used honest assessment scales of the candidates to be able to see how people voted under a particular voting method, and then how that differed compared to their honest assessments of the candidates, to see different kinds of aspects of strategic voting. And it also made interesting candidate profiles to see the types of distribution of support that they had, whether, for instance, people either loved them or hated them, or they had and we were also able to see, for instance, under the approval voting ballots, we could see the extent that voters cross-supported multiple candidates. So you could look at a particular candidate and then see how many people that voted for that candidate also supported other candidates. So you could see which candidates had cross support, which is not something that I had seen before in terms of being explicitly stated and shown. And of course, like we mentioned before, third parties and independents do really well under approval voting. And that was reflected clearly, which has been consistent with other pieces of literature. So under plurality voting, they get some minuscule of support, whereas approval voting, it can often get 5-10 times more support. And on that note, it's really interesting that happened in this election too, because there was a Gallup poll earlier in the year for 2016 that indicated that 2/3 of people didn't even know who Stein, the Green Party candidate, and Johnson, the Libertarian Party candidate, were, and yet they were able to still get much more support on approval voting despite those odds.
Interesting. So is the data? So did you have data on where in the country these voters were, and their demographics, like social, economic, and sex, and all that kind of? So you have data on all that stuff.
That's right. Yeah, that's
where the crossovers are, right?
So like within the sampling, we used an approach called stratified sampling. So we look at what the demographic of like all these types of characteristics of the population that we're interested in, and then making sure that when we're sampling, that we get kind of a miniature and picture of what the overall population looks like. And to the degree that we're off there, we can use reweighting to adjust that data to make sure that it better fits that larger picture of the population that we're sampling from.
Okay. Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay, so that was the first project, which sounds really fascinating. So you don't have a publishing date estimated at this point, right?
We're going to try to have it, I would say, a preliminary paper while it's in the process of being published before the end of the year.
Oh, okay.
But in terms of the actual publishing date, that's probably going to take longer because academic publishing takes forever.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so so the North Dakota one, that's something that's actually actively being tested. Your system's being tested now, right? Or method.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about that.
So we're really excited about what's going on in North Dakota. Approval voting is a method that's been studied since the late 1970s academics, Stephen Brams, a political scientist, and Peter Fishburne, a mathematician, independently developed by others, including Guy Ottawile and other researchers. But Peter Fishburne and Stephen Brams are really the ones who put the academic groundwork underneath it. And so this has been studied for such a long time. We've seen organizations, particularly mathematical organizations, implement this, but we haven't seen this being used for government office. And that's so that's one reason we're really excited about this, because this is going to be the first use of directly. So if approval voting was implemented, and here we're talking about approval voting being on the ballot for the city of Fargo, to be able to have the citizens of Fargo use approval voting for their local elections. And so this has not happened before in the US. This would be the proof of concept for approval voting in government elections.
Wow. So who are they? So this is their next election they're using this in, or what election are they getting?
They would be using it for their following election. So this November, they're going to be voting on a ballot initiative on whether to use approval voting in a following election.
Okay.
Yeah. And
wow, so that's exciting. So you must be pushing hard to educate the public on what it is, so when they go to vote, they know what it is, instead of just saying no.
That's
right. Yeah.
That's completely right. So with running ballot initiatives, you have an education and awareness component, and then a persuasion and conversion component where you're trying to get people to vote. Fortunately, we've teamed up with a wonderful organization on the ground, Reform Fargo, who was really the initial motivator for this effort. So the backstory for this is that the city of Fargo had some strange elections. There was one election they were electing a city commissioner. Here, the city commissioners happened to be being elected by themselves, and there were like six candidates or so running in that election, and the candidate who won with less than 25% of the vote. And so it was really alarming to a lot of people.
And that's because there were so many candidates, the votes got spread out amongst too many candidates. So 25% was the high point. That was that happens here.
And it's tough because when you have, in practice, when you have that many candidates running and your voting method forces you to choose only one candidate, it's really almost a lottery if the winner is getting that small percentage of the vote. Like the lottery is like, who knows if that person was actually the person who the will of the people wanted to see elected. Right.
Yeah, we see that, we see that when we have multiple people running for mayor, right? The guy who's not maybe representing the people the best could be elected mayor, right? So we've seen that where it's getting very competitive, and lots and lots of people are running for one office. So it is the siphoning off thing does happen. So yeah, that's interesting. So in North Dakota, it's going to be on the ballot measure to see whether they will try this. Is it try, or is it a change the system forever? Is it just a trial? Let's try one election this way, or how is the ballot measure being written? What are they being asked?
It'll change all future elections, all future local elections. So when they elect their mayor, they will use approval voting. When they elect commissioners, they will use approval voting. So all local elections.
Yeah, an all-in deal, huh?
That's right.
Okay. No testers, we're going for it. Okay, so so do you have any other examples of projects you're working on, or are those the two main ones?
Those are two of the big ones. We're also, so for instance, this is our first year where we've been able to bring on staff. So we've just gone through the large part of the initial part of the year, making sure that we have good people brought on. And one thing that is kind of going on in the background, that our supporters will see at the end of the year is we are completely redoing our website. And so we have a lot of information on our website.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy to find and being able to sort through it. And so we're trying to make that easier for people who are excited by voting methods. They want to learn more. They want to learn how these systems work, how they compare with other systems. And they also want to know what they can do to make a difference, because they're tired of using this incompetent voting method that they have this terrible tool to use. And they're using this terrible tool to elect people who have huge decision power, affecting their day-to-day vast sums of money. So we have a lot of our supporters who are upset and want to make sure that we're using reasonable tools to elect these people with all this responsibility. And by revamping our site, we're working to make sure that we have a clear guide for how they can get involved and change this.
Yeah, it is a really good website already, though it was very informative for me. I liked it. Okay, and so if I understand right, you've also done some consulting a little bit on different elections, or what kind of consulting have you done in the past, or maybe currently?
They're probably one of our most exciting ones was that, so the client that we worked with before was the Webby Awards. And this one was really interesting, although we had a complicated problem in front of us. So the Webby Awards, they get all these submissions every year, and all these people are trying to win a Webby for their category, for their type of, like whether they have like a business category or some kind of search or shopping category. But getting a Webby Award is really prestigious. And so they want to make sure that,
for people who don't know what a Webby is, I don't know what Webby is. What is that award for?
Something like a best website within a particular category.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
And so it's really competitive, and you have all these people that are trying to get this award. And so they wanted to make sure that they were using the best voting method as possible in order to decide who got this award for each of these categories. And the problem that they had was they had a ton of applicants within each category, but they had limited resources in terms of the judges that they had. And so they had to figure out how to prioritize judges' time by who would get evaluated next within that category. So we wound up using a score voting method for the first round to see who got into the second round. And what we would do is we would make sure that each judge evaluated the candidates a minimum number of times to be able to have an initial sample of where they were. And then we knew that the top, say, 5 candidates would go on to the next round. And so from there, we saw what the threshold was. So whatever the 5th candidate was, their score under score voting, where you score each candidate, that we knew that was going to be the threshold. And so we were able to come up with this formula that figured out, given that a candidate was able to be evaluated one more time, what's the probability that they would move either below or above the threshold? And depending on what that probability was, determined where they were in the queuing list. And that would determine which candidate would be evaluated next by the judge. So it's kind of a complicated problem, but that's what we did for the Webby Awards. And they were pretty excited by it because it allowed them to efficiently use their resources for their judges.
Right. So you were just actually getting the candidate list, sorted or trimmed down for the judges to be able to pick from the best of the best, let's say.
Yeah, there we determined the algorithm to determine for which order a candidate would be evaluated in. And we also determined the voting method that would be used to evaluate each of the candidates.
Okay. And then what system did they use for the actual voting?
Score. They used score voting for or range voting for that one.
Okay.
And the reason for that was because they had a fewer number of judges. So when you have a whole bunch of people, oftentimes it makes sense to just use approval voting. But when you have a few number of voters, it can often make sense to use range voting. And the reason for that is a technical one. So range voting, it allows you more sensitivity with your expression because you're scoring across a scale. So you have all these kind of small differences that you can express. And when you're doing that, when you have a small sample size, what that does is it reduces the amount of error or randomness that can occur. But with approval voting, the sensitivity is small. You either approve of a candidate or you don't. And so when you have a small voting population, particularly like if it's fewer than like 50 or 10 or 50 voters, it can produce a bit more noise. And so you may want to wait to use approval voting until you have a larger voting population of, say, 100 or more. You can still use it with fewer voters, but given the choice, it probably makes sense to use something like range or score voting when you have fewer voters. And of course, it really never makes sense to use plurality voting or first past the post unless you only have two candidates running.
Interesting. Okay. Wow. Okay. So any other types of consulting that you've done or that you could do? Now you have staff, right?
That's right. Yeah. So the one thing that we're looking to do is we want to also make it easy for organizations to use better voting methods. So a lot of times we'll look at different types of awards organizations, like there's the Webby Awards, but there are all kinds of organizations give away awards. You have chili cook-offs, like whether it be something informal or formal. So we have we have organizations that we're a part of where we elect people to certain positions. We have contests, and these have varying degrees of importance, but never does it make any sense for us to use a terrible voting method. We know that plurality voting, when we choose only one candidate or option, that it's a terrible voting method because you have vote splitting, and that can lead to somebody you that doesn't deserve to win. It can have that person win or option win. And it also doesn't do a very good job of reflecting support for other options that didn't win. And so you get a bad outcome and you don't treat the other options that were in the running fairly. And so it's really, unless you only have two candidates, which it's not a very good election if you only have two options anyway, whether you're voting on people running for office or chili or whatever you're doing.
Right.
And so when we're in these informal decision-making processes, we can also use these opportunities in order to use better voting methods. And so one of the things that we're working on behind the scenes as we're developing our site is making sure that people have clear resources on being able to run their own elections, whether they be informal or formal, using better voting methods. You can find some of these things on our site already, but we're trying to ramp that up.
So here in California, we have the top two. Have you heard, about this top two thing, right? So we'll have, because the League of Women Voters, we do these candidate forums, right? So some people don't think we should even do them in the primary, and I'm against that because I think it's the only time that people will get to see all the candidates, right? Because as soon as the vote happens, it's the top two that go to the top, and oftentimes they're very similar. They're from the same party or from, ideology or what have you. So I just think that this probably would be much better, even though you have 14 people that want to be our state senator. That happened a couple of years ago. This probably would have helped people decide, vote as opposed to the top two, I guess. So do you see how it would improve in other states? I don't know every state's voting voting methods, but do you have examples of other states where this would be better than what they've got, where this would solve the multiple candidate thing? I think is just the real deal here, right?
Yeah. So in terms of other states that approval voting would be useful in, I would say all of them. So
just some are really bad, you know.
So the state of affairs is that for our most important decisions, like deciding who gets elected in these offices that spend vast amount of money and determine our day-to-day lives through policy, we use the worst voting method there is in order to get them elected, and that is choosing one candidate with the most votes wins. And so we get terrible outcomes as a result of that, but there are also a number of ancillary harms that come about from using this terrible voting method. So there are direct and indirect harms. So one is, like, we're aware of the spoiler effect when a third-party candidate runs and they're similar enough to another candidate that they split those votes and some other less popular candidate overall wins the election. And we don't see that as being fair. And a lot of major parties aren't that excited about that either, because it means one of them is getting bumped over. So unfortunately, the solution to that is, well, when you're running an election, the voting method doesn't matter so much if you only have two candidates. Their plurality voting is actually fine. But when you have more than two candidates, that's when the voting method becomes really important. And so major parties are aware of this. And so instead of using a better voting method that accommodates more than two candidates, a lot of times what they do instead is they'll make really harsh ballot access laws that makes it so that only the two major party candidates wind up on the ballot. And so that's not the voting method itself that's those laws, but it's a result of the voting method that's causing these other undemocratic laws coming into effect that gives us fewer choices.
So a question that came up was, how do you think your method would influence the money in politics? Like, the League is very concerned about money in politics, you know, all that stuff. So how do you think would this help the diminish the amount that's spent in campaigns, or do you think it would not have? What's your best guess at that?
I'm inclined to think that it would diminish the influence of spending on particular candidates. And the way that I would see that happening is through more candidates running. So when you have more candidates running and there being competition within those candidates who are running, it makes it a lot harder for somebody trying to influence the outcome of the election through money. So imagine if you had a bunch of money and you were trying to control the outcome of the election or influence people. It would be to your benefit for there to only be two candidates.
Right.
So like, if there are only two, you could maybe hedge your bets and put your money in both candidates' pockets to influence their policy decisions. Or if you really wanted to see one candidate win, you could support that candidate. But if you're using a voting method like approval voting, where candidates aren't afraid of running and they don't have to worry about viability so much in order to get support,
right,
you can see more candidates running, and more candidates can not only run but be competitive at the same time. And now if you're trying to influence the election with money, you've got a harder dilemma in front of you. So you can't just put all your money on one candidate, because like, you have all this competition from other candidates at the same time. And if you're trying to hedge your bets and put money in all the candidates' pockets, well, now you've got to have deeper pockets yourselves in order to be able to fill all those candidates' pockets.
Yeah. Yeah, my instinct is that if those candidates are going to get to be on the ballot anyway, people will still have choice. So it's not a knock this guy out of the race kind of thing anymore. It's influence people's thoughts about the election, which, yeah, I guess they still can. But yeah, it would be interesting to see that, right? Okay, so we're kind of at the end of our time. It just flies by every time. I can't believe it. So do you want to tell people a little bit about how they can find you, whether, well, obviously online, but are you going to be live? I think you're going to be at Politicon, right? You're going to have a booth there in October?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
On our an event page that you can find places that will be. We will be in Los Angeles for Politicon October 20th and 21st. But the easiest way to track us down is to go to our website at electionscience.org. You can sign up for our newsletter, which goes out at the end of every month. And you can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, all that good stuff. So we're easy to find, and you can track our progress and figure out how to get involved yourself.
Okay, and if people want to donate or support you or volunteer, is there a place on your website for that if they want to learn more about bringing your method to their local community, or maybe just donate?
Totally. If you want to donate, you can go right to our site on the, we've got a donate button right on the menu bar at the top of the site.
And you're a 501c3, right? I should have asked that.
That's correct, yeah. We're a 501c3, which means that your donation is tax deductible.
Right.
And being an attorney, if you have like special giving that you want to do for particular types of assets, can totally help you out there.
You'll take their stock, huh?
Yes, we'll totally take their stock.
Okay.
Nice way to donate. Like there are technical reasons why that's a nice way to donate.
Yeah, it's an awesome way to donate, right? Okay. And Mr. I don't know if he says Wa or Va, but he says there are 2 online articles that articulate how the voting system can be more or less vulnerable to money. So that would be interesting to learn. I don't know if he means your website or another, but I think online would probably mean Google it. But that's interesting. So thank you to Mr. Wa who participated. Okay, so I guess that's all. Is there any, kind of final thoughts that you have?
I would encourage people to follow Fargo. We're really making history there. The organization that's running the ballot initiative locally is Reform Fargo. And so you can find them on social media as well. And if you want to learn more, go to electionscience.org, learn about our work, sign up for our newsletter. And
I'm definitely signing up for that newsletter, that's for sure. Well, thanks for taking time. I know it's late in Cincinnati, so I really appreciate your time, your education, and participating in the Learn with the League. And hopefully we'll see you very soon, and we'll follow the Fargo process. So progress, when is their ballot, when is their election?
So they had, but their election itself is going to be on November 6th. It'll be for their general election.
Okay, got it. So we'll have to watch for that on November 7th to see what happened.
November 6th. Oh, yeah. So the day after, yeah.
Hey,
yeah.
I'm in California. I'm used to waiting for results for a week. So, So thank you very much, Aaron. It's been a real pleasure, and we'll see you soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Athena.
So everyone, if you would like to join us and get our newsletters, you can like our Facebook page, and you'll be notified of live events. But also, you can text us, LWVTA, and you text to 444999, and you'll be automatically added to our mailing list, and you'll be notified of live events around here. So thank you much for joining us. Thank you again, Aaron. I so appreciate your time.